Hello, and a warm welcome to Field 2, Individual Morality and Social Justice. My name is Johann Frick, and I'll be your professor for this class. Before I begin today's lecture, let me address the elephant in the room. The fact that we're not assembled in one of Berkeley's lecture halls. The fact that you're having to watch me through a screen. It's hard to believe that 2 years into this pandemic, we find ourselves in this place again. And yet, here we are. I'm so sorry for the way in which each and every one of you has been impacted by this global emergency. Many of you have already been through a year or more of virtual teaching, and believe me, I understand if you're not relishing the thought of returning online. Over the course of the pandemic, many of you have lost relatives and friends, and some of you have gotten sick yourselves. Many of you and your families have had your lives and livelihoods disrupted. I'm so sorry for all these losses. As a professor, I too feel a keen sense of loss at your absence at the start of this semester. I'll miss the buzz I get out of talking philosophy with you in person. I'll miss the hands that shoot up in lecture when I ask a question, even a hard one. And I will miss the way you politely laugh at my bad jokes. Believe me, the classroom is a lonely place without its students. And yet, there is light at the end of the tunnel. As you know, the current plan of the administration is that after 2 weeks of online teaching, we will be able to return to in-person instruction. I sincerely hope that this will be the case. In the meanwhile, let us all strive to make the best of this most unusual of semesters, so that years from now, we can look back on this period, not with fondness, but at least with a sense of pride at having risen to the challenge. And with that, let us begin. This course is an introduction to some central themes of moral and political philosophy. Moral philosophy as a discipline can be roughly divided into 3 parts: normative ethics, meta-ethics, and practical ethics. Normative ethics is the systematic study of what is morally right or wrong, good or bad, praise or blameworthy, and why. In part 1 of this course, starting today, we will closely examine a number of rival moral theories that provide answers to these questions. We will contrast so-called utilitarian, or more broadly, consequentialist moral theories with various alternatives, such as contractualism and Kantian ethics, and investigate their respective strengths and weaknesses. Amongst the questions we will discuss are: what makes an action morally right or wrong, and why? Is the right action always the one with the best consequences? Do the intentions with which we act make a difference to whether our actions are morally permissible or not? Is there a moral difference between killing someone and letting someone die? Could there be such a thing as moral luck? In other words, could the amount of praise or blame we deserve for our actions or for our character, could it ever be a function of factors that are beyond our control? The second, much shorter part of this course will be devoted to meta-ethics. Now, meta-ethics examines the philosophical underpinnings of moral thought and practice, in particular from the point of view of metaphysics, epistemology, and philosophy of language. Among the meta-ethical questions we will consider are the following: can there be such a thing as free will in a deterministic universe? Could we be morally responsible for our actions, even if we couldn't have acted otherwise? And is there a single true morality, or is moral truth relative to cultures or to individuals? In the third part of this class, which will take up roughly the second half of the semester, we will turn to questions in practical ethics. There, we will look at a number of concrete ethical issues, often connected to the broader theoretical debates in normative ethics and meta-ethics that we examined earlier in the semester. These practical issues include: what is the moral status of future persons who do not presently exist? And how should the answer to this question inform our thinking about our personal reproductive decisions, as well as our thinking about larger societal issues such as global climate change? Is there anything wrong with committing suicide? Is it morally permissible to have an abortion? If yes, why and under what circumstances? What moral weight should we give to animal suffering? And is it ever right to rear animals in order to kill and eat them? Interspersed in this second half of our class, we will also concern ourselves with some questions from the domain of political philosophy. Now, like moral philosophy, political philosophy concerns itself with questions of right or wrong, good or bad, just or unjust. But in political philosophy, the focus of these questions is not the behavior of private individuals, but rather the structure of our society and its institutions writ large. Some of the central questions of political philosophy concern the appropriate role of the state and the limits it places on individual liberty. We'll look, for instance, at the question of freedom and paternalism. Is it ever right to restrict someone's freedom for their own good? And what moral limits, if any, should there be on our freedom of speech and expression? Should some things not be for sale? As a concrete case study, we'll examine the practice of commercial surrogate motherhood. Is there anything morally problematic, we'll ask, with paying a woman to gestate your future child? We'll also look at various theories of social justice. What would a just society look like, and how would it distribute the goods and advantages that we produce through social cooperation? Does it matter in itself if some individuals are worse off than others? Or can inequality sometimes be justified, particularly if they make the worst off group of society better off than they otherwise would have been? Is redistributive taxation a form of theft, as some libertarian philosophers assert, or rather a requirement of basic fairness? And how exactly do social injustices arise? Does every injustice require a culpable agent, someone who is at fault and to blame for the injustice? Or could unjust outcomes arise even amongst entirely well-intentioned people due to various structural features of our society? So that roughly is our program for the semester. Now, I know that for many of you, this is your very first time studying philosophy, let alone moral and political philosophy in particular. And I know that that can be a source of anxiety. But to this I say, don't worry. This course will presuppose absolutely no prior knowledge of philosophy. And as in many other intellectual disciplines, practice makes perfect. As I see it, philosophy is not just a body of knowledge and doctrines, but a set of techniques and habits of mind. In this course, the emphasis won't be just on learning, and God forbid, memorizing specific doctrines of specific philosophers. At least as important to me is to arm you with certain moral concepts and distinctions, to equip you with a sense of what a successful moral argument is and how it is put together. Now, one thing that's unusual about philosophers I can tell you about right away, and I think it's best done in the form of a joke. I warn you, like most of my jokes, it's not very good, but here goes. 3 tourists, a sociologist, a physicist, and a philosopher, are hiking in the Scottish Highlands. They crest a hill and see profiled against the horizon a black shape. As they get closer, the shape turns in their direction, looks at them, and goes, "Meh!" The sociologist is the first to speak. "Ah, friends, there we have it," he says. "The sheep in Scotland are black." The physicist immediately interjects. "Not so fast, my friend. All we can say is that there's at least one black sheep in Scotland." Whereupon the philosopher turns to the physicist and says, "Slow down, man, you're jumping to conclusions. All we can really say is that there's at least one sheep in Scotland that is black on at least one side." Now, that's of course a malicious parody, but there's a kernel of truth in this joke. In doing philosophy, we try to cultivate a way of thinking that is almost unnaturally circumspect and precise, even by the standards of other disciplines. A large part of learning to become a philosopher is to get good at reading philosophical texts. By now, you will have hopefully all had a thorough look at the syllabus for this class. If not, you can find it on the B Courses website. The syllabus lists the schedule of topics and readings for the rest of the semester, including occasional bonus readings and videos. It's very important that you do all assigned readings before you watch the corresponding lecture. For most lectures, the readings are very manageable in length. So use the time you gain to do the readings extra thoroughly and, if necessary, more than once. There are two required books, Immanuel Kant's Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals and John Stuart Mill's On Liberty. Details about the preferred editions are again on the syllabus, but all other readings are posted as PDFs on the course website. In a few weeks' time, before your first writing assignment is due, I will also devote part of a lecture to the art of writing a philosophy paper. Now, of invaluable help on your journey to becoming philosophers will be the weekly discussion section with your GSI. These will start in the second week of classes, once enrollment has stabilized. There are 4 wonderful GSIs for this class who will lead discussion sections and also grade your papers. Let's briefly meet them.
Hi, I'm Micah Dubroy. I'm a graduate student here in the philosophy department at Berkeley, and I'm excited to be a GSI for this course. These days, I mostly think about issues in philosophy of mind, perception, and aesthetics, but my original love in philosophy was ethics, and I'm really excited to return to that material with you this semester.
Hi, everybody. My name is Scott Castleton. I'm the GSI for the Wednesday afternoon sections. This is my second time GSIing for Phil 2, and I'm a 5th year in the philosophy department. I am writing my dissertation on freedom of speech. More specifically, I work on freedom of speech on the internet. And so it's kind of a intersection of political philosophy, moral philosophy, and the law. I'm really looking forward to GSIing with all of you this semester.
Hi everyone, I'm Virginia. I'm a 2nd year in the philosophy PhD program here at Berkeley. My main philosophical interests are in moral philosophy, with a particular interest in applied ethics and legal philosophy. I'm really excited to be teaching this course this semester, and I hope that you'll all come to my Zoom office hours so that I can get to know you a bit better. And hopefully I will meet you in person soon.
My name is Milan. I'm a 2nd year philosophy PhD student. I'm mostly interested in ethics, and I'm really excited to be GSIing for this course.
Finally, in order to give you all a chance to dialogue with me about the material covered in lectures, this class will be holding a 1-hour weekly town hall every Friday. During the initial period of virtual instruction, the town halls will be held live on Zoom on Friday from 12:10 to 1 p.m. You can find the Zoom link on the syllabus. But once we return to in-person instruction, the town halls will take place in Lewis Hall 100, just like the lectures. I can't tell you how much I look forward to meeting you all in person. All right, enough of logistics. Time to do some philosophy. As I said, we begin with normative ethics. One of the most famous and influential normative ethical theories is the family of views known as consequentialism. That is what today's assigned reading, The Consequentialist Perspective by William Shaw, was about. What I want to do in today's lecture is to give you a quick introduction to consequentialism and to show you how many of the topics that we'll be discussing this semester can be understood as raising questions about different aspects of the consequentialist viewpoint. Now, you've all done the assigned reading, I hope. It will provide the foundation for a lot of what we'll discuss in the coming 15 weeks. So, if necessary, please go back and read it before you watch any further. All right, so let's begin by reviewing some key concepts from Shaw's text. I'll start us off with a basic question. What is consequentialism a theory about? In other words, what is the question to which consequentialism provides an answer? Why don't you pause the video and take a moment to think of your response? All right, here's how I would answer the question. Consequentialism is a theory of morally right action. In other words, consequentialism seeks to tell us when an action is morally right or morally wrong, and why it is morally right or wrong. That is the question which consequentialism is trying to answer. Now, what is the answer that consequentialism provides to this question? When and why is an action morally right according to the consequentialist? Now, that's the next question I want to put to you. How would a consequentialist fill in the blank in the following statement? An action is morally right if and only if ... I'm looking specifically for the answer that would be given by what William Shaw in his paper calls standard consequentialism, and what is more commonly referred to in the literature as act consequentialism. Again, please pause the video and try to figure out the answer for yourself. I encourage you to refer back to the reading if necessary. All right, welcome back. Here's the answer. According to standard consequentialist or act consequentialist, an act is right if and only if its consequences are at least as good as those of any alternative possible act in that situation. Now, let me remark on some aspects of this definition. As we can see, consequentialism makes the rightness of an action a function of the goodness of the consequences it produces. Whether an action is morally right or wrong depends on how good its consequences are compared to those of alternative possible actions that the agent could have chosen to perform instead. Now, that thought in itself is not unique to consequentialism. Indeed, as the philosopher John Rawls puts it in his famous Theory of Justice, I quote, "All ethical doctrines worth our attention take consequences into account in judging rightness. One which did not would simply be irrational, crazy," end quote. The defining mark of consequentialism as an ethical theory is not that the consequences matter in judging the rightness of our actions. It is that they are the only thing that matters. For the consequentialist, in other words, the right is an exclusive function of the good. What is more, act consequentialism in particular is a maximizing doctrine. An act is morally right if and only if it produces the best consequences of all the possible acts available in that situation. Maximizing goodness is both the sufficient and the necessary condition of an action's being morally right as opposed to wrong. Okay, so that in a nutshell is the doctrine of act consequentialism. Now, consequentialism as an ethical theory is incomplete. It tells us to act so as to bring about as much good as we can, but it doesn't say what the good is or consists in. What we are lacking so far is what philosophers call a theory of the good. What is it that makes an outcome good? What is the goodness of an outcome a function of? So this is where a second important term from today's reading comes in, namely that of utilitarianism. Here's another question, and again, I encourage you to pause the video and think of the answer yourself. What is utilitarianism, and how does it relate to consequentialism? Well, utilitarianism is a type of consequentialism. Indeed, it is the most famous and historically influential member of the family of consequentialist ethical views. Utilitarianism, we might say, stands to consequentialism like red stands to color. Utilitarianism incorporates the theory of the right that is common to all consequentialist views, namely, an action is right if and only if it produces the best possible consequences. and it then plugs in a specific theory of the good. Specifically, according to utilitarians, the only thing that is ultimately good or bad is the well-being or ill-being of sentient creatures, such as people or animals. Hence, the action that maximizes the good in a given situation is that which produces the greatest net balance of well-being minus ill-being. So from this, we get a complete statement of the doctrine of act utilitarianism. An act is right if and only if its consequences contain at least as large a net balance of well-being minus ill-being as those of any alternative possible act in that situation. Some of the greatest moral philosophers in history have been consequentialists. Here are 4 of them. Jeremy Bentham, born 1748, died 1832, was a British moral philosopher, jurist, and social reformer, and is considered the father of modern utilitarianism. He famously distilled his utilitarian credo to the principle that it is the greatest happiness of the greatest number that is the measure of right and wrong. Now, why am I showing you 2 pictures of Bentham, you ask? And what on earth does the second picture show? Well, the macabre truth is that what you see in the second picture is nothing other than the embalmed corpse of Jeremy Bentham. As per Bentham's own wishes, it has been kept on display at the University College London ever since his death. He sometimes even attends board meetings. You think I'm joking, right? I'm not. Here's the photographic proof. The second of the giants of 19th century utilitarianism was John Stuart Mill, born 1806 and died 1873. We'll be reading his classic treatise on liberty later in the semester. Third on my list is Derek Parfit, one of the great geniuses of 20th century moral philosophy. He taught for many years at All Souls College at Oxford University. We'll read a number of texts by him this semester, starting with his thoughts about what makes someone's life go best next week. Finally, we have the Australian philosopher Peter Singer, whose classic paper, Famine, Affluence and Morality, will be the subject of our very next lecture. Why have these and many other great minds been attracted to consequentialism? What does the view have going for it as a theory of right action? Well, quite a lot, in fact. Among the 2 principal attractions of consequentialism is that it is a powerful and systematic moral theory that offers clear guidance in most situations. To know what the right thing to do is, work out which of the courses of action available to you would have the best consequences, and you're done. Secondly, compared to most of its rivals, consequentialism relies on only a small number of moral intuitions. 2 of them, to be precise. Namely, 1, that the right is a function of the goodness of consequences, and 2, the maximizing idea, that the right action in a given situation is that which produces the best consequences. Now, these intuitions strike many people as overwhelmingly plausible, indeed almost as self-evident. How could it not be right to perform the action that will produce the best consequences, we might wonder. In addition, these intuitions are highly general in character. For that reason, they are perhaps less likely to be contaminated by various forms of bias or motivated reasoning stemming from cultural traditions, class interest, or sheer selfishness. And yet, at the same time, by no means all moral philosophers are consequentialists. Indeed, a lot of the development of moral philosophy, particularly over the course of the 20th century, can be seen as pointing out various implications of consequentialism that strike a lot of us as intuitively problematic, and then trying to develop alternative ethical theories that avoid these problems. This rival family of ethical views is generally referred to simply as non-consequentialist views, since what unites them is primarily their rejection of some basic tenets of consequentialism. Let's look at a first case, which highlights one implication of consequentialism that some moral philosophers view as problematic. Imagine that during some military exercise, an accident has happened. A live grenade has rolled into a trench, threatening to blow up everyone in that trench. One soldier reacts. He jumps on the grenade, smothering it with his body. The soldier knows that he will die, but 5 of his comrades in the trench, who would otherwise have been killed in the blast, will be saved by his action. Let us also assume that the soldier knows that had he not jumped on the grenade, he himself would likely have lived. Let's ask ourselves a few questions about this case. First, a relatively straightforward one. Do we think that what the soldier did was morally permissible, that is, not morally wrong? Well, clearly yes. Indeed, it seems we can say more than that. The soldier's action seems morally praiseworthy. He's a hero for having selflessly sacrificed himself to save 5 lives. But now consider a second question. Do you think it would have been morally wrong or impermissible for the soldier not to lay down his life in this way? Now, I can't peer through your computer screens into your minds, but I'm sure that for many of you listening to this lecture, the answer to my second question is no. It would not have been morally wrong for the soldier to fail to jump on the grenade and lay down his own life. He's a hero for having done it, but morality doesn't make such acts of heroism obligatory. So, to those of you who answer yes to my first question, but no to the second, you think that while the soldier's action was clearly morally permissible, indeed praiseworthy, it was at the same time not morally required. This illustrates an important way in which common sense ethical thought departs from consequentialism. In common sense morality, the fact that an action is morally permissible and praiseworthy does not always entail that it is morally required or obligatory. Moral philosophers have a technical term for this. We say that an act is supererogatory if and only if it is morally praiseworthy, but not morally required. It goes above and beyond moral duty. It isn't morally wrong not to do the act. Now, one notable feature of act consequentialism is that it leaves no room for supererogation. If an act is right, according to act consequentialism, it is at the same time morally required. This is because the only act that is right or permissible in a given situation, according to act consequentialism, is that which maximizes the good. So if it was right for the soldier to sacrifice his life, because doing so resulted in the loss of only 1 life, when otherwise 5 lives would have been lost, he was in fact required to do so. Not to lay down his life would have been morally wrong. This feature of consequentialism, that it leaves no room for supererogation, can make it a very demanding ethical view. We'll return to questions about the demandingness of ethical theories in our next class when we read Peter Singer's paper on charitable giving and our obligations to the global poor. But for the time being, let's move on to a new question. We've seen that consequentialism makes the right a function of the overall goodness of the outcome. But how is this overall goodness to be determined? Consequentialists endorse an idea which we can call interpersonal aggregation. It says, benefits and harms to different individuals should be morally summed. We ought to do what produces the most goodness in the aggregate. Now, this idea seems plausible enough in some cases. For instance, given a choice between saving 1 stranger or instead saving the lives of 5 different strangers, many think you morally ought to save the 5, though we will see later this semester that some philosophers have disputed even this thought. In other cases, however, aggregative reasoning can have implications that are much less intuitively palatable, especially in cases where it enjoins us to let a few people suffer very large losses so that many other people can enjoy much smaller benefits. The philosopher Tim Scanlon provides a famous illustration. Let's fast forward to the end of this year. Let's hope that by then humanity has finally vanquished the coronavirus and the Soccer World Cup is underway. It's the final match of the tournament. Germany are playing Brazil, and over 1 billion spectators around the world have tuned in to watch. It's a cracking game, giving the spectators much pleasure. Then it happens. There's an accident in the TV broadcasting station that is beaming the game all over the planet. Jones, a poor engineer, is trapped under fallen electrical equipment and is receiving extremely painful, indeed life-threatening electrical shocks. Alas, if we turn off the power to save him, billions of viewers will miss the last half hour of the World Cup final. What's the right thing to do? And let us ask 2 questions. First, how would a consequentialist reason about this case? Second, do we agree with this reasoning? So let's take the first question first. The pleasure that each spectator gets out of watching the last half hour of the match is admittedly tiny compared to the excruciating agony that Jones is suffering in the transmitter room. But then again, there are so many spectators, each receiving this small amount of pleasure. For the consequentialist, there must be some number of spectators large enough that the combined benefits to the spectators morally outweighs Jones' agony, even his possible death. Perhaps that number is 1 billion, perhaps it is more, perhaps it is less. The point is that, by the logic of interpersonal aggregation, if the number of people watching the game gets sufficiently large, the right thing to do eventually becomes leaving the power on. It's simple mathematics. But is this the right way to reason about this case? Not according to Scanlon. For Scanlon, it would be wrong not to save Jones from his agony, no matter how many people are watching the game. The benefit of watching a soccer match, he reasons, is trivial compared to the agony of suffering strong electrical shocks. No matter how large the sum of these benefits, it would be wrong to keep the power on. The right way to analyze transmitter room is not by looking at benefits and harms in the aggregate, but by examining how people are affected as individuals. Scanlon's own moral theory, moral contractualism, which we'll encounter in 2 weeks' time, provides a worked out account of how to do this. Let's look at another aspect of consequentialism. For consequentialism, the rightness of an action is solely a function of the goodness of its consequences, we've said. But 2 actions with the same consequences can be performed with very different intentions. Can this not make a difference to their rightness? So to illustrate what I'm talking about, compare the following pair of cases. Suppose that in the course of fighting a just war, a general orders the bombing of a munitions factory, foreseeing but not intending that 50 innocent civilians will die as collateral damage. The general rightly expects that this will hasten the end of the war by 1 month, saving many lives. Let's call this case tactical bombing. Now, contrast this tactical bombing case with the following variation. In the course of fighting a just war, a general orders the bombing of a residential area in order to sow terror among the civilian population and undermine enemy morale. He foresees and intends that 50 civilians will die as a result. But he rightly expects that this will hasten the end of the war by 1 month, saving many lives. Let's call this case terror bombing. Now, what do we see when we compare these 2 scenarios? Well, the goodness of the expected result is comparable in both cases. 50 innocent civilians will die, but the end of the war will be hastened by 1 month, saving many lives. For the consequentialist, this is all that matters. So if we think that it is permissible for the general to order the tactical bombing in the first scenario, then it must also be permissible to terror bomb, as in the second scenario. But are the two courses of action both permissible? Many moral philosophers answer no. In particular, defenders of the so-called doctrine of double effect, which is central to moral thought in the Catholic tradition, maintain that the fact that the deaths of the civilians are merely foreseen in tactical bombing, whereas they are expressly intended in terror bombing, this makes a crucial difference to the morality of these two bombing raids, they assert. Whereas it is sometimes morally permissible to take an action foreseeing but not intending that it will cause harm to innocents, it is never morally permissible to intend to cause harm to innocent people. We'll examine this doctrine in more detail on February 9th, when we will read Warren Quinn's article on the doctrine of double effect. Let's turn to a final question, that of killing versus letting die. According to act consequentialism, when our acts will affect who lives or dies, what matters morally to the assessment of our act is how many people will live and how many people will die. By contrast, the precise causal details of how this result comes about, they're typically deemed morally irrelevant. Let's look more closely at the implications of that claim, again by examining a pair of cases. So here's the first case. Let's call it triage. Imagine that an ambulance team must decide to drive to the site of one of two accidents. They know that at location A, there's one person who will die unless he receives urgent medical attention. At location B, there are 5 people who will die unless they receive urgent medical attention. The ambulance team can either save the 1 at location 1 or the 5 at location 2, but there's not enough time to save both groups. The ambulance team goes to the second location and saves 5 lives. The person at the first location dies. Has the ambulance team done the right thing? Many would say yes. Now consider a contrasting and rather gruesome scenario. Let's call it organ harvesting. So imagine that patient A has come to the hospital for a routine operation. She's otherwise in splendid health. She's currently under general anesthesia and is lying in the operating theater. Then 5 accident victims are brought in, each in need of a life-saving organ transplant. Patient B needs a kidney, patient C needs a heart, patient D needs a liver, and so on. If they do not receive these organs within hours, they will die. Unfortunately, the hospital has no healthy organs to transplant. The only source of healthy organs is patient A. The surgeon knows that if she kills patient A and harvests his organs, she could save the 5 lives of patients B, C, D, E, and F. And suppose she does. Has she done the right thing? Well, act consequentialism suggests that if it is permissible to save the lives of the 5 accident victims in triage, then it is also permissible to do so in organ harvesting, provided there are no further unforeseen effects of doing so. In both cases, what the agents do ends up with 5 lives being saved and 1 person being dead. But many recoil at the thought that it would be morally permissible to harvest the organs of an unsuspecting patient. Here's a possible explanation for people's differing judgments about triage and organ harvesting. In triage, the ambulance team saves 5 lives and lets 1 die. In organ harvesting, the surgeon saves 5 lives and kills 1. This pair of cases suggests that, contrary to the assertions of consequentialism, there may in fact be a morally important distinction between killing and letting die. Now, generalizing from this, we might be tempted to endorse the following simple maxim. Never kill one, even if that means letting 5 die. But is this maxim perhaps too simple? A famous, or perhaps I should say infamous, thought experiment suggests that the answer may be yes. Take a look at this diagram. No, in fact, that won't do. It's an altogether too bloodless illustration that doesn't properly capture the drama of the situation. Let's go with this livelier picture instead. Voila! So what is depicted in this image? Let me narrate for you the drama unfolding before our eyes. A runaway trolley is barreling down the tracks. Up ahead on the track are 5 workmen without means of escape. You are a bystander observing this scene. If you do nothing, the 5 will be crushed to death by the trolley. But next to you is a switch that can turn the trolley onto a side track away from the 5. Unfortunately, there's a single person on the side track, likewise without means of escape. If you turn the trolley onto the side track, he will be crushed to death. What's the right thing to do? Well, psychologists have extensively studied people's responses to this type of scenario, and they find that between 80 and 90% of respondents judge that it is morally permissible for the bystander to turn the trolley. Suppose that this is right. Well, why does our reaction to the trolley case challenge the simple maxim that you should never kill one, even if that means letting 5 die? Well, think about it. If you do nothing and let the trolley continue on its way, you let 5 die. By contrast, if you pull the switch and turn the trolley, you kill the one person on the sidetrack. And yet, many of us think it is permissible to turn the trolley in this case. So this suggests that our duty not to kill doesn't always win out against our duty to prevent death. So the truth is perhaps more complicated. Indeed, we will find that it is a lot more complicated when we read Judith Thomson's paper on the trolley problem a few weeks from now. All right, that's as much as I wanted to say by way of previewing the rest of this course. I hope that this first lecture has given you some idea of what this class will be like, both in terms of the topics we will cover and in terms of the case-driven style of doing moral philosophy that we will practice. I look forward to the intellectual journey we're about to take together.